Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of With the British Army in the Holy Land, by H. O. Locke. Chapter 11, The Holy City.
It is beyond the scope of this book to attempt a detailed history of Jerusalem. It cannot, however, fail to interest those readers who have followed us thus far if we glance at a few incidents in the history of this sacred spot. Of little importance, perhaps non-existent, in the days of the patriarchs, and still in the hands of the Jebusites through the days of Joshua, the Judges, and Samuel, it first sprang into fame about 1,000 years before Christ, when it was captured by King David, who made it his capital. Solomon built his temple on Mount Moriah, and prayed to Jehovah that he would especially hear the prayers of his people when they prayed toward the city which he had chosen, and the house which Solomon had built for his name. Then did this city become, and has ever since remained, the sacred city of the Jews. With the advent of Christ, born within a few miles of its walls, who here preached and healed, instituted his holy sacrament, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead and buried, and the third day rose again from the dead, who here laid the foundations of the most beautiful religion that the world has ever seen, Jerusalem became, and has ever since remained, the sacred city of the Christian. And then, 600 years later, came the rise of Islam. The great prophet Mahomet, in evolving his religion, based his teaching upon the principles of Judaism and Christianity, the prophets of which were to be honored, including the prophet David and the prophet Christ. So, in accordance with the prayer of Solomon, and until the antagonism between Judaism and Islam led to the substitution of Mecca, it was towards Jerusalem that devout Muslims were required to turn when they prayed. From Mount Moriah did Mahomet, as his followers believe, miraculously ascend to heaven. And so did Jerusalem become, and has ever since remained, no less a sacred city of the Mohammedan. Thus it will be seen that Jerusalem, the sacred city of three mighty religions, became the most holy city in the world, the poetical prototype of heaven. Jerusalem, situate away on the hills and far from the main trading and military route, was of but little commercial or strategical importance. Yet we readily understand how its religious value caused it so often to become the goal and prize of contending creeds and armies. Sometimes the motive was religious antagonism, as with Antiochus Epiphanes and Titus. Sometimes it was religious devotion, as with the Maccabees and Crusaders. Pitiful though it be, yet, throughout the ages, the city of the Prince of Peace has been associated with the most terrible scenes, the most savage excesses, in the whole dreadful drama of war. Not once, nor twice, in the reigns of the kings of Judah and Israel, did Jerusalem resound with the clash of arms. Although, after the fall of the northern kingdom, it was delivered by divine intervention from the invasion of Sennacherib, yet its submersion by the rising tide of Babylon could not long be averted. The evil day had only been postponed, and, in 607 BC, Jerusalem fell before Nebuchadnezzar, before that power which, like Turkey of yesterday, dominated the whole stretch of country from the Persian Gulf to the border of Egypt. 20 years later, Jerusalem, with the Temple of Solomon, was destroyed, the city, palaces and temple being leveled in one, and the population were put to death or led away captive to Babylon. When, some years later, the capital of the Babylonians was captured by the Persians and their empire annexed, the Jews were permitted to return to Jerusalem. In the 6th and 5th centuries BC, the temple and walls were rebuilt under Ezra and Nehemiah, and Jerusalem took a fresh lease of life as a Jewish city. In the 4th century BC, when Alexander the Great marched southwards through Syria to Egypt, securing the Mediterranean littoral before embarking on his expedition into Asia, overthrowing Tyre in his march and totally destroying Gaza, the Jews no doubt made their submission, and their city thus escaped destruction. After the death of Alexander, Judea did not escape the anarchy which ensued during the internecine warfare waged by his generals and successors. In 321 BC, Ptolemy I, king of Egypt, advanced against Jerusalem, and, assaulting it on the Sabbath, the Jews' day of rest, met with no resistance. He is said to have carried away 100,000 captives, whom he settled in Alexandria and Cyrene. The founding of a Syro-Grecian kingdom in northern Syria brought Judea again into the unfortunate situation of a buffer state. Jerusalem seemed doomed to be among the prizes of an interminable warfare between the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucidae of Syria, and in turns vassal to each. At the commencement of the 2nd century BC, Judea passed into the hands of the Syrian king Antiochus the Great, who at once proceeded to ingratiate himself with the whole nation. It was not the tyranny of foreign sovereigns, but the unprincipled ambition of their own native rulers that led to calamities little less dreadful than the Babylonian captivity. Jason, the high priest, had been dispossessed by his brother Menelaus, by double-dealing with the Syrian king, who at this time was Antiochus Epiphanes. A rumor of the king's death having reached Palestine in 170 BC, Jason seized the opportunity and revolted against his brother Menelaus. But the rumor was false. The intelligence of the insurrection, magnified into a deliberate revolt of the whole nation, reached Antiochus. He marched without delay against Jerusalem, put to death in 3 days' time 40,000 of the inhabitants, and seized as many more to be sold as slaves. He entered every court of the temple, pillaged the treasury, and seized all the sacred utensils. He then commanded a great sow to be sacrificed on the altar of burnt offerings, part of the flesh to be boiled, and the liquor from the unclean animal to be sprinkled over every part of the temple, and thus desecrated with the most odious defilement the sacred place which the Jews had considered for centuries the one holy spot in all the universe. 2 years afterwards, Antiochus determined to exterminate the Hebrew race from the face of the earth. This produced the revolt of the Jews under Mattathias, whose illustrious son, Judas Maccabus, founded the Maccabean dynasty. By 128 BC, the Jews, under John Hyrcanus, recovered their complete independence, which they maintained until compelled to acknowledge the dominion of Rome. But the native rulers could not govern for long without dissension. Soon were 2 more competitors, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, quarreling about the succession to the Jewish throne. The Republic of Rome, having trampled underfoot the pride and strength of the great Asiatic monarchies, assumed a right of interfering in the affairs of every independent kingdom. The ambassadors of Aristobulus and Hyrcanus appeared before Pompey, who was then in Syria and was at the zenith of his power. After subjugating Arabia, Pompey, in 63 BC, marched directly into Judea. Espousing the candidature of Hyrcanus, Pompey marched against Jerusalem, within the walls of which he was admitted by the party of Hyrcanus. Aristobulus and his supporters, with the priesthood, withdrew to the temple and prepared for an obstinate defense. At the end of 3 months, and after great loss of life, the Romans made themselves masters of the temple. The conduct of the Roman general excited at once the horror and the admiration of the Jews. He entered the temple and even penetrated and profaned with his heathen presence the Holy of Holies. All the riches he left untouched, and the temple he commanded to be purified from the carnage of his soldiers. He stipulated the tribute which the country was to pay, demolished the walls of the city, and nominated Hyrcanus to the priesthood, though without the royal diadem. The magnanimity of Pompey, in respecting the treasures of the temple, could not obliterate the deeper impression of Jewish hatred excited by his profanation of the sacred precincts. From this time forward, Judea becomes more and more under the shadow of Rome. The walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt by Antipater, and later the temple, which had become much dilapidated, was demolished and rebuilt in great magnificence by Herod the Great. He was the last king of Judea with any semblance of autonomy, and in the year AD 6, Palestine was annexed to the Roman Empire. We pass over the incidents in the life and death of our Lord, which, at the time, could have but little affected current events, but which were destined to influence so deeply the subsequent history, not merely of Palestine, but of the whole world. And we come to the cataclysm of which our Lord had been the sorrowful yet unerring prophet. Blinded by religious fanaticism, and convinced that God must fight upon their side and give victory to his chosen people, be their conduct never so cruel and their bearing never so arrogant, the Jewish race, though a mere handful of men, offered war to the mistress of the world. With little military organization or training, divided by factions and torn asunder by internal dissensions, they yet dared to defy the mighty power of Rome. They defeated the ill-starred expedition of Cestius Gallus and inflicted upon the Roman arms the most terrible disgrace they had ever endured in the East. But the triumph was short-lived. A terrible revenge was at hand. It was in this year, AD 70, that Titus laid siege to the city. At the time, its population was swollen 10 or 20-fold by the pilgrims attending the Passover. The reserves of food were destroyed in faction fights, even before the Romans arrived outside the city walls. Of all wretched and bloody sieges in the world's history, few, if any, have been more wretched or more bloody than the siege of Jerusalem by Titus. Fierce and bloody as was the fighting, the deaths from sickness and famine were yet more terrible. Dead bodies were thrown out into the valleys, where they lay rotting, a loathsome mass. The number of those who died in the siege were estimated at 600,000. At night, miserable, starving wretches would steal into the ravines to gather roots for food. Here they were pounced upon by ambushed Romans and crucified by hundreds next morning in full view of the battlements. Gradually, the assaulting Romans got possession of portions of the city, yet the portions still uncaptured refused to surrender. Their defenders still hoping against hope for a divine intervention, as in the days of Sennacherib. At length the city fell. The Romans, pouring in, began by slaying indiscriminately. Tiring of butchery, they turned their thoughts to plunder, but stood aghast at the houses filled with dead and putrefying corpses. The temple of Herod was burnt, the city was desolate, while those whose miseries had not been relieved by death were carried away into yet more miserable slavery or to a death more ignominious at Rome. As a Jewish city, Jerusalem had perished forever. 60 years later, Jerusalem was rebuilt by the Emperor Hadrian. He resolved to suppress altogether the troublesome and turbulent Judaism. The measures which he took caused the Jews to rise against him under Bar Kokhba. This was the wildest and the most bloodthirsty of all the Jewish revolts, but it was the last. Jerusalem having been recaptured, Hadrian converted it into a Roman colony, forbade Jews to approach, and built a temple of Jupiter on the site of the temple. It was when the Roman Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity, and his mother Helena discovered the true cross and the holy places, that Jerusalem came again into prominence. Thereafter, churches and monasteries sprung up throughout Palestine, which thus, for a time, became thoroughly Christianized, under the Christian emperors of Rome and Byzantium. But the 7th century saw the fall of the Christian ascendancy in Syria. In AD 614, the Persians, under Chosroes, swept through the land, massacring the Christians wholesale and destroying most of their churches, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The withdrawal of the Persians was followed by a brief return of Christian ascendancy, lasting but 8 years, under the Emperor Heraclius. And then, in 637, Jerusalem fell to the growing power of Islam. It was this new religion, with a calendar only dating from AD 622, which was to control the future destinies of the Holy City. Islam arose at Mecca and Medina in barren and uninviting Arabia. When it started on that expansion, whereby it overspread half of the known world, Syria, from its situation, was naturally the first country to tempt its restless and devoted Arab warriors. Within 10 years of the Hegira, or commencement of the Mohammedan era, we find the followers of the Prophet already in Syria. The Byzantine army was overwhelmed at the Battle of the Yarmouk, and the Arabs laid siege to Jerusalem. The city capitulated to Omar, who granted terms of comparative magnanimity. His terms gave to the Christians security of person and property, safety of their churches, and non-interference on the part of Mohammedans with their religious exercises, houses, or institutions. Upon the site of the temple, which had been systematically defiled by the Christians out of abhorrence for the Jews, but which was honoured by the Muslims as the spot from which Muhammad ascended to heaven, was now erected the Mosque of Omar. This site became to the Mussulman the most venerated spot in Jerusalem, as was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to the Christian. When, in after years, pilgrimages to Mecca were temporarily interrupted, devout Mohammedans made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem instead. For the next few centuries, Christian and Muslim lived together upon a fairly workable basis of toleration. Massacres of Christians and destruction of their churches occurred periodically, either in revenge for Christian successes elsewhere or in connection with other Mussulman disorders when mutual assassination was popular. But, on the whole, Pilgrims, who at this time swarmed from all over Europe to visit the holy places at Jerusalem, were allowed to do so comparatively unmolested. That is, they were probably not robbed more in Palestine than in other professedly Christian countries through which they had to pass along their road. Had the Arab Mussulman remained master of Jerusalem, the Christians of Europe would probably have remained content with the situation. A change came in the year 1077. Jerusalem was then taken by the Turks, who had conquered all Asia Minor and were already threatening the Byzantine Empire in Europe. The treatment which the Christian pilgrims now received at Jerusalem aroused intense indignation in Europe, chiefly stimulated by the preaching of Peter the Hermit. Other motives there were, such as the protection of the Byzantine Empire from the menaces of the Turk, the desire of the Latin Church to prevail over the Byzantine, and the temptations always offered in a holy war of loot upon earth and salvation in heaven. Nevertheless, there undoubtedly spread, throughout Western Europe, a mighty wave of religious enthusiasm which was sincere. The First Crusade was mainly recruited in France. Great were the vicissitudes through which the Crusaders passed on their pilgrimage through Europe and Asia Minor, largely through quarrels with their fellow Christians before the Turks had even been encountered or their country entered. Having defeated the Turks at Antioch, the army marched south along the coast and at length reached and besieged Jerusalem. Of the numbers that set out from Western Europe, probably not less than 1 million, only a remnant of 20,000 fighting men, with an equal number of followers, had reached the Holy City. Though thus decimated and war-weary, the Crusaders were ecstatic with religious fervour. St. George was said to have appeared to them clad in shining armour. The Saracens gave way, and Jerusalem was taken by assault. The usual massacre of the inhabitants followed, and estimates of the slain vary from 40 to 100,000. In 1099 was established the Christian Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Kingdom of the Crusaders, Latin in creed, French in nationality, feudal in character, and precarious in existence. The state of affairs seems now rather to have resembled the relationship which formerly existed between the Hebrews and the Philistines, or, even more analogously, that between the Italian city-states of the Middle Ages. Most of the cities of Palestine were gradually annexed by the Christians, but some, notably Ascalon, did not pass out of the hands of the Saracens for many decades. Accordingly, wars became matters of almost annual occurrence, and never, during the whole 80 years of its existence, was the Kingdom of Jerusalem free from war and war's alarms. The bulk of the original Crusaders left alive soon returned to their homes in Europe. There was little or no native Christian population on which to draw, and the kingdom became dependent for the support of its army, both as to men and money, on the pilgrims that swarmed from Europe to Jerusalem. Naval assistance was given by Genoese and by Venetians, more, alas, from motives of commerce than of piety. Religious enthusiasm had been capable of conquering and establishing this kingdom, but it proved quite unequal to the tasks of sustenance or protection. And so, after 80 years of romance and trouble, of love and war, of lust and murder, often inflicted, more often endured, this kingdom fell because it had no sure foundation. The decline and fall of the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem forms a sordid story of jealousy and intrigue, of futile ambition and divided counsels, of perjury and perfidy. The Crusaders intermarried with the women of the country, and except so far as it was constantly recruited from Europe, the race rapidly degenerated. With no resources at their back, except the charity of Europe, the Crusaders yet had dreams of worldly aggrandizement, which included in their ken the whole of Egypt and Syria. The Second Crusade of 1146-9 came, not to conquer, but to support and defend this already tottering kingdom. It did that kingdom more harm than good, for it drained Europe of its potential pilgrims, anticipating and exhausting the natural flow of men and money on which the kingdom had come to rely, and dissipated them on a futile attempt to annex Damascus. The Knights Templars, the feudal barons of the country, built castles throughout the land, and lived at constant variance with the king and central government. Every baron fought for his own land and for his own aggrandizement. The kingdom of Jerusalem was fast tottering to its fall. It was in 1187 that Saladin, having made himself master of Egypt and of Damascus, attacked Tiberias as a first step towards overthrowing the kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusaders moved against him from Sephuria. It was July, and the Crusaders were absolutely without water. The Saracens, with Lake Tiberias at their back, had abundance. The Crusaders, suffering terribly from thirst, nevertheless attacked. The result of the battle was a foregone conclusion. Here, at the Horns of Hattin, the Mount of Beatitudes, was the Crusaders' army destroyed and the power of the Christian completely crushed. Jerusalem itself, after a short, fierce struggle, fell in the following October. The inhabitants were not put to the sword. Huge ransoms were paid, and the Christian population allowed to disperse throughout Syria. Jerusalem had passed again, it seemed as if forever, into the hands of the Mohammedan. The news of the fall of Jerusalem was received in Europe with a thrill of horror and indignation. Thereupon set forth the Third Crusade, that which is identified with Richard I of England. Travelling by sea, these crusaders avoided the horrible sufferings inevitable to the crossing of Asia Minor. Acre was captured in 1190 by the Crusaders, after a siege lasting for 2 years. Thence they marched southwards, through Caesarea to Jaffa, fighting on their way the great battle of Assur, when Saladin was defeated. But Richard, instead of marching upon Jerusalem, which lay in his grasp, vacillated and negotiated. At length he decided to go up against Jerusalem. Some 20 miles from the city he stopped. Again he vacillated. Dissensions broke out between the Duke of Burgundy and King Richard. The design of besieging Jerusalem was given up, and the army slowly and sadly returned to Jaffa. Thereupon, in 1192, a peace was concluded, whereby the seacoast from Jaffa to Acre was ceded to the Franks, but Jerusalem still remained in the hands of the Saracens. There were several more crusades. None of them, unless we accept the treaty of the excommunicated Frederick in 1229, ever reached Jerusalem. Some of them never even reached Palestine, being shamefully diverted to other purposes. Saddest of all was the Children's Crusade, when 50,000 poor misguided children followed the cross, like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, to slavery, dishonour, or death. But these form no part of the history of Jerusalem. In 1244, we find Christian and Saracen making common cause in Palestine against the Khwarezmians. These Mongols, who only appeared on the stage of history for a brief period of 4 years, swept through the country, captured Jerusalem, massacred all on whom they could lay hands, Muslim and Christian alike, and destroyed such sacred relics as they could find. Then, defeated by the Egyptians, they perished out of history as suddenly as they had appeared. In 1291, the Christians, by this time reduced to their last stronghold of Acre, were finally expelled by the Moslems from Palestine, and that was the end of the Crusades. Europe became reconciled to the fact that the kingdom of Christ is a kingdom, not of the sword, but of the soul. And so the watchword by which the Crusades were inspired now became the consolation of their end, Dieu le veut. In 1400, Syria and Palestine fell under another Mongol invasion by Timur the Tartar, Tamerlane. In 1517, Palestine was annexed to the Ottoman Empire under Selim I, of which empire it has since formed an integral part. At the close of the 18th century, Napoleon marched through the country, defeating the Turks at Gaza and on the plain of Esdraelon, but was forced to withdraw. In 1832, Muhammad Ali, having thrown off the Turkish yoke in Egypt, conquered Syria, but 9 years later, through the action of the European powers, the country was restored again to the Ottoman port. Insofar as any principles can be deduced from this history, they seem to show that Jerusalem, situated as it is, could never become the capital of a great empire. On the other hand, this city, coveted by so many races and creeds, must be safeguarded by the arms and resources of some great empire, or it can never remain at peace. It may be of interest to close this resume of the history of Jerusalem by comparing the route taken by General Allenby with those taken by previous soldiers in their conquests of Judea. The routes taken by the British have already been fully described. In only one known case, that of the First Crusade, had Judea been successfully invaded before by an invader who had not previously made himself master of at least 3 of her borders. The attempt at a swift rush across one border made by Cestius Gallus ended in a failure, which was only wiped out 4 years later after the Romans, under Vespasian and Titus, had first overrun Galilee and Samaria and mastered the strongholds round the Judean borders. This was the policy followed, 1,000 years later, by Saladin. The upland of Judea has almost never been invaded from the barren, waterless south. David, operating from Hebron, must have approached Jerusalem from the south, but he was already in possession of the Judean plateau. The original attempt of the Israelites to enter the country from the south was checked, and they subsequently crossed the Jordan and entered Judea through Jericho from the east. The Philistines must have come up by the passes from the west. Sennacherib did not approach Jerusalem himself, but it was whilst warring against Egypt at Lachish, Tel el-Hesi on the maritime plain, that he sent his arrogant message to Jerusalem, and it was on the plain that his victorious army, infected by the plague from Egypt, melted away as by a miracle. Egypt was his objective, not Judea. Nebuchadnezzar may have invaded Judea from the north, but it is more probable that he also came up from the west, after first making himself master of the maritime plain. Pompey was returning from his expedition in Arabia when he invaded, so he entered from the east, ascending the Judean plateau by way of Jericho and Bethel. Herod invaded from the north. In the Christian era, Cestius Gallus made his disastrous expedition by the valley of Ajalon, Beth-horon, and Gibeon. Titus, after the surrounding country had been subjugated, moved his army up to Jerusalem by Gophna, Juphna, and Bethel, and so through Beira from the northwest and north. The Moslems, in 637, first captured Damascus. Subsequently, they approached Jerusalem across the Jordan. The first Crusaders came through Asia Minor and won a decisive victory at Antioch. Thence they came southward along the coast, through Ramla, and up the valley of Ajalon, their advance through the mountains being unopposed. Saladin, by the decisive battle of Hattin, near Tiberias, made himself master of the surrounding country before closing in upon Jerusalem, which he eventually did from Hebron, south, from Ascalon, west, and from the north. In the Third Crusade, Richard and his crusaders came oversea to Acre. After marching to Ramla, they tried first to reach the Holy City up the valley of Ajalon, and afterwards by the Vale of Elah, the Wadi es-Sunt, further to the south, but both attempts failed. Many of the invading armies that have swept through Palestine have confined themselves to the great intercontinental road along the maritime plain and have passed by Jerusalem, secure upon its plateau. We have seen that this was so with Sennacherib. This was probably the case with Alexander the Great, and was undoubtedly so with Napoleon. The latter defeated the Turks at Gaza, and again on the plain of Esdraelon. His objective was Syria, but he was foiled by the action of the British in the siege of Acre. This distraction also prevented him from making any attempt to reach Jerusalem. Prior to the arrival of the British, it was 7 centuries since a Christian conqueror had set foot in Jerusalem. But there was now no gloating of the cross over the crescent. On the contrary, guards of Moslem troops from our Indian army were placed upon every building sacred to Islam, while Christian guards were mounted over those sacred to Christianity. Never before had Jerusalem fallen into the hands of conquerors so zealous for the safety of its populace, or so concerned for the preservation of the city and all that it contained.
This concludes today's reading of With the British Army in the Holy Land, by H. O. Locke. Join us also tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.